Yeah.
Awesome. Okay.
Ready?
Yep. Let's go. Let's laugh. We are imperfect after all.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to the Imperfect Us podcast.
I'm Leanne Camilleri.
And I'm Lisa Downs. As hosts of the Imperfect Us podcast, we share relatable stories that celebrate we are all perfectly imperfect humans, leading perfectly imperfect lives. We discover practical and evidence-based strategies that draw on the science of well-being and positive psychology that help us to uncover the barriers that might hold us back from being our authentic selves and turn them into opportunities so that we can show up more consistently, doing what we really aspire to do and who we want to be.
We acknowledge the Wadawurrung and the Kaurna people as traditional custodians of the beautiful lands on which this podcast is being recorded. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to other First Nations people who are here with us today. So, let's get started.
Hi everyone. What do you get when you combine ASD, ADHD, acquired physical disability, an award-winning veterinary career, a master's degree in positive psychology, insatiable curiosity, and a complete disregard for contextual knowledge boundaries? You get Dr. Jody Wilson, dedicated disruptive influence, author, speaker, and La Trobe University autism researcher. Jody describes herself as a talented overthinker who can talk underwater. She's a fan of explicit communication and thinks unexamined social rules are stupid. We are really looking forward to learning from Dr. Jody today, so let's dive on in. Jody, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's great to come and have a chat with you, ladies.
Jody, we would really love to learn more about what led you to the positively disruptive work that you're doing to support neurodivergent professionals.
Oh, well, I'm an adult diagnosed autistic and ADHD person myself. I was diagnosed actually just before I started doing MAP. And so for me, as an adult diagnosed autistic person particularly, there really wasn't any instruction books. It was like becoming a parent again for the first time. You bring the baby home and you think, where the hell is my instruction book? Getting handed the certificate joining me to the Cool Kids Club, here's your neurodivergent brain, off you go, left me floundering. I knew what wasn't working for me, but I didn't know how to find the things that would. And that's one of the things that I found really challenging during the Masters in Pos Psych, was that all the ways, all the interventions were supposed to work in brains didn't work that way for me. So I was glad that I had been identified as autistic, because otherwise it would have been another small T trauma on top of the many small T traumas of my life of Jody getting it wrong, which is Jody, the autistic person, trying to fumble her way through living in a world that's designed for a neuro majority that isn't the same as me. And so I always wanted to be a vet. I was a good vet. I was an award-winning vet. I was working in Australia's busiest specialty hospital as an emergency and clinical care vet. And I unfortunately acquired a physical disability that ended my veterinary career, which was really tough because being a vet was such an important part of my identity. And I had to, I guess, rebuild that identity, and reconstructing identity is such a process. It's something that happens naturally over decades as we grow into adulthood and develop our ideas about who we are. It's something that should happen slowly and incrementally. But when you lose an enormous part of your identity, you have to construct the rest of that fast, because otherwise there's a gaping hole in your psyche, and nobody wants to walk around with a gaping hole in their psyche. So for me, because I'd just gotten the identification as being neurodivergent, and I'd found out all the ways that psychology and positive psychology particularly didn't work for me, made me really interested to think about what that hole was in the research about, I guess, finding out what we knew about well-being and autistic people and maybe looking for that instruction book that I didn't get when I got my diagnosis. So there's no instruction book. There's still no instruction book. But what I'm trying to do, I guess, with the research that I'm doing at La Trobe and with my book and with the coaching and the DEI work that I do, is trying to make it so less people need an instruction book, because there's more of that stuff out there for people to see. And I'm a really strong believer in the fact that you can't be what you can't see. And if I'd been able to see another visible neurodivergent professional when I got my diagnosis, then I wouldn't have been so scared about what my future was going to look like, because it was scary, not knowing what's going to happen, not knowing who you are, and not knowing how to better survive in a world that's traumatized you up to this point. It's a really scary place to be.
I feel quite privileged having sat alongside you through that journey with positive psychology. And from the outside looking in, it was so admirable watching you navigate that and finding your way through. I learned things from you, which I often share with people today. When we think about that identity change, it's a big whack, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. It's literally our identities are what informs our behavior. It's even what informs our emotions and our responses to situations, because those underlying schemas of identity literally are the building blocks of which our personality are made. And so losing what, for me, I mean, I think I was 4 the first time I announced I was going to be a vet. And it was unwavering. And I never wanted to be anything else. And so for me, that had always been integral to the identity that I'd constructed for myself. There was never any question that I was going to be anything other than a vet. So when suddenly that part of my identity was amputated, essentially, I had to learn to navigate a new normal, only it wasn't a normal. And I think that's the thing that made it just that much harder, was that my new normal was so different from what normal was. Being neurodivergent rather than being part of the neuro majority means that you actually interact with the world differently. And we're understanding a lot more about how autistic brains particularly engage with the world on a sensory basis. And one of the really interesting things is that it's very likely that neurodivergent brains have no sensory filters, or very minimal sensory filters. So for a neurotypical brain, that's when you're trying to concentrate on something in an environment that's not really conducive to that, eventually your brain will habituate to what's going on around you, and you'll be able to block out some of the repetitive noise, or forget that you're cold, or forget that the tag on your jumper is touching you. For people who are neurodivergent, we don't have those sensory filters. And so we're processing so much sensory information all the time that our cognitive and emotional resources are often exhausted way before anybody believes that, including us, that they should be. And so it does make it very difficult to interact with the world, especially in unfamiliar places when we don't know what to expect.
You're so right in saying that, and how you've articulated that is really amazing. I work in education and I see that a lot, particularly in our younger children. And the confidence that they have is that they're willing to share what it's like as well. Like they don't have that mask yet, I guess, that tries to hide it. They just tell you that it's not. And I learned a lot working alongside those beautiful humans to be able to share what that was like. And so then what do they need, and asking them. And I think that's such a really wonderful way of expressing what that's like from a neurodivergent perspective and those who are not. It's such a wonderful thing to say. Just thinking about the experiences of neurodivergent people, could you help us to understand some of the challenges that are experienced by neurodivergent professionals?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the biggest challenges is that the understanding of neurodivergence in the general population is very stereotyped. When we think about autism, those of us who are old enough think about Rain Man. Everybody else thinks in terms of the good doctor or love on the spectrum. Those stereotypical presentations of autism. Interestingly, autistic brains are much more diverse within that categorization than neurotypical brains are. So autistic people are even more different from each other compared with neurotypical people. And the characteristics and profiles associated with autism are so heterogeneous that it's almost impossible to say this is a normal experience for an autistic person. And that's one of the challenges, is that nobody can develop that rule book for us. And so because nobody can develop that rule book, that how to, we have to get to know ourselves and our own autistic profiles and our own needs and our own challenges. We know the rough categories of challenges that we're likely to face, and those categories of challenge form part of the diagnostic criteria for autism and for ADHD. And there's social and communication issues. There a need for repetitive or sameness, a need to engage deeply with special interests, and they're being much more sensitive to the sensory input in the world. And those things are often unavoidable in professional situations. As a vet, I have a lot of noise cancelling headphones that and I guess for me, I started using them years before I knew that I was neurodivergent. But once I knew why I was using them, I was less hesitant to use them. And I guess that was the value of identification for me. Autistic professionals often really struggle with the relational parts of work. As communicators, we tend to be quite blunt and direct, which people often misinterpret as having underlying subtext. And one of the really interesting things is that neurotypical people often have a lot of subtext when they're talking, in terms of things that they're hinting at in terms of body language and facial expressions. Autistic people, you can generally just listen to the words, and what the meaning the words give you is the meaning that we're trying to get across. But that's often not understood. And there's something called the double empathy problem, which is a really beautiful understanding of how autistic people and neurotypical people differ in their perceptions of the same interaction. So often the general understanding is that autistic people often lack empathy. The truth is that we express empathy differently from how you would expect a neurotypical person to express it. And so it's not recognised by neurotypical people. In the other direction, autistic people often think that neurotypical people are mean. They're not trying to be mean, they're trying to understand and navigate an interaction with us. But because we don't understand that, we interpret what they're doing differently. And so you've got that double misinterpretation and that double misunderstanding. And it's not that either side lacks empathy, it's that we don't understand what empathy looks like for each other. And that's a very good model for what it's like to interact with the world as an autistic person. We don't know what we don't know, and we don't even know what we do know because we keep getting told we're wrong.
That explains the experience for many of us. When I look back a few years back now, before I was awake to neurodiversity, I can think of people I might have thought as rude, who I felt didn't understand me. You would see conflict perhaps in the workplace because of that. Really interesting, that double empathy. I haven't heard of that term before, and I think it really it explains a lot.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful explanation of the problem, and it's and I guess that's what we need, more translators who can stand with a foot in each world and help us to connect. And I guess for me, in my research position, that's one of the things I'm trying to do is be one of those translators who can stand with a foot in each side of the divide and try and make sure that we get those connections and those understandings so that there is less of the problem and more of the empathy.
I think, Jody, one of the biggest things I mentioned before about being in education, I'm moving to a different role shortly, and quite interesting that we've been talking about how we get children, particularly young children, and hopefully that'll go through the school. How do we support them in getting to see other children for who they are? And so where does that match? So I look forward to finding out what you find out and perhaps share some other with you later on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's wonderful that we're now embracing those aspects of universal design. It's not how can we help the autistic kids, it's how can we help every kid to be their authentic, thriving self. And I think that as the underlying principle of the interventions that we design and use in that space is probably the best thing that we can do. Let's not worry about categories. Let's worry about making sure that everybody's needs are met.
And that everybody understands what their strengths are and how important they are to other people to identify and perhaps use and learn from. So absolutely. Thank you so much for that.
Jody, there's new rules and laws around psychosocial safety in the workplace. And when we think about psychological safety and perhaps disclosing a diagnosis, I would imagine we would feel safer with some more than others and perhaps not at all at times. How does that impact well-being?
Hugely. It's one of the factors that I think it's really important to assess for neurodivergent people who are considering disclosure at work. And disclosure is not always the best choice, unfortunately. I would love a world where we're all free to be our whole authentic selves, but often for neurodivergent people, they've learnt that the world can be a really dangerous place. We know as human beings that our connection to other human beings has probably been an enabler of a sort of long-term success as a species. And so a threat to social belonging feels like a threat to survival. And for autistic people who have struggled with social belonging for their whole lives, it is a really dangerous thing to enter a space where you're going to put yourself more at risk in terms of your psychosocial safety. So one of the things that I talk about in my book is literally assessing how safe you feel in your workplace as part of your assessment of whether or not you want to disclose. Is disclosure not just right for you, but is it right for you in this place at this time? And that's a really important consideration. Without psychosocial safety, the damage that can be done by making yourself vulnerable is horrific. And that's regardless of your neurotype. We know that there is absolutely legislative requirement across Australia now to ensure psychosocial safety of employees. Having legislation and having the principles that underpin that legislation enacted, unfortunately, are sometimes very different things. So if people are already in a workplace that makes them feel psychologically unsafe, if there's not a person who's a focus of psychological safety for them in that space, then probably disclosure is not a good choice.
Yeah, thanks for that. I can see how, just the different workplaces that I've worked in through my time, I can see those scenarios playing out. One place it might be people embrace everyone for no matter who they are, and whereas other environments can be extremely judgmental and exclusive, and it's a tricky world out there, isn't it?
It's a tricky world for everyone, and I think that's the thing, is that it is, and I'm absolutely not trying to downplay how tricky the world can be for anyone to negotiate. It's just negotiating it with that extra uncertainty just makes it that little bit trickier. And I think that I'm very protective of my neuro tribe. I don't want to put them in a position, any of us in a position where anyone can hurt them any more than we've already been hurt. So it's one of the reasons that I think it's really important that if you're going to disclose at work, and that's if you're going to disclose anything personal, this isn't just talking about neurodivergence. This is talking about any health condition, any disability, any social factor that is important to you. It can be something as important as gender or as simple as I'm getting a dog. But those things, if they're important to you, then you're vulnerable by putting them out into the world. And so you need to assess whether or not your workplace is a safe place to put those vulnerable things out into the world. If it's not, I suggest you probably need a new workplace, but that's not as easy as it sounds for many people.
Yeah.
True.
And if they've had a previous experience of not a great outcome, then that's going to also support that not wanting to share as well, where they should have an opportunity to be able to speak in their workplace as long as it is a safe place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really interesting things that's come out of research in the last 10 years is that it's very likely that we can consider othering as a co-occurring condition of neurodivergence. One of the reasons for that is the othering behaviour. So the othering, we all heard it, but we don't all necessarily know exactly what it means. So othering, if we want to look at a definition, means that two social groups with uneven power, where the members of the group with more power use a characteristic of the members of the group with less power to reduce their power further. So in that case, if we look at othering as being defined by those two social groups, we can see othering of children happening as young as 12 months of age. That's before it's possible to make an identification of autism. It's well before it's possible to make an identification of ADHD. Children are a product of their home environments. So if there are mindsets at home that are not conducive to being comfortable in a diverse environment, then it's really likely that those kids are going to bring those same sort of restricted views to kindy and to school. And so othering of neurodivergent kids can begin well before it's possible to actually formally identify them, because as social creatures, we can see difference a mile off, even if we don't have a name for that difference. And that's one of the reasons that we talk about small t trauma, but it's actually when small t trauma is enacted over and over and over again, it becomes complex trauma. And, complex trauma is a really good trigger of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we often find that that many people who've experienced othering across their lifetime without explanation, and without explanation is pretty important. If you have an explanation, you can fight back. If you don't have an explanation, you're a victim, because there's nothing to fight back against. So especially for people who are diagnosed as adults, that trauma becomes fairly comprehensively part of the way they see the world, and it becomes really difficult for them to make those social connections that they need to as human beings. And while social and communication difficulties are part of the autism spectrum, they don't negate the need for human connection. And that's something that my need for solitude to recharge does not negate my need for human connection. I crave human connection. I just have to plan it in ways that my brain can cope with. And so I've become very good at essentially knowing how many spoons I've got left in a day, because you guys know about spoon theory, right? Yep. So spoon theory being spoons representing a unit of cognitive or emotional energy. You have a certain number you start the day with. And each activity that you do uses up a spoon or many spoons. For many neurotypical people, even those with chronic illness, it's fairly predictable how many spoons are going to be used for a particular activity. If you have a chronic illness or disability that fluctuates, then your spoons become a little bit less a little bit less static. So it might take, instead of taking 1 spoon to do a thing, it might take 6 spoons to do the same thing the next day. When you add neurodivergence into that, the spoons are never even the same size. We don't know how many spoons we've got. We can't count them. We don't know what size they are. And we don't know if they're imaginary spoons or real spoons. And if we go and pick them up, they might just disappear. So for me, planning activities always involves a certain amount of guesswork as to how I'm going to feel before, during, and after. Understanding myself and the way my brain works, I now know that if I've run out of spoons 10 minutes after getting there, I'm going to say, thanks, guys, it was really good to see you. I need to go, and not be unhappy about it.
Yeah.
But before my identification, I'd have to grit my teeth and keep going, because that just meant I was failing if I couldn't stay there. And so it becomes really difficult without understanding yourself to understand how to achieve that human connection that we all need.
I guess that wanting to be understood and that deep feeling for wanting to belong is ingrained in young people. And that othering that you mentioned as you were speaking it, I was seeing it, and seeing that also perhaps people in their kindest of intentions do that.
Absolutely do. And it's really interesting. We've just submitted a big research paper that we've been writing for the last couple of years. It's a qualitative analysis of the experiences of autistic adults seeking support for their mental health and suicidal ideation. So it's a big, important paper. It's really important stuff. And one of the themes that came out of my analysis of that paper was that invalidation and othering often seem to come from a place of good intentions, which is entirely perplexing. I do not understand how you can other someone with good intentions. I've experienced it, so I know that it's true and it does happen.
Yeah.
But it's one of those disconnects where I'm like, sorry, I don't understand how that's an actual thing. I've seen it happen, but I don't want to believe in it.
I'm just loving this conversation, Jody. Would you mind sharing a success story or stories of neurodivergent professionals who have successfully navigated some disclosures in the workplace? And I know that maybe a favourite tip that we can learn from their journeys.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess one of the difficulties with answering this question is that most of the success stories I know are of people who aren't necessarily openly disclosed in their public lives as well as their professional lives, even though they may have disclosed it at work. So I don't want to out anybody, but there are a few people who, like me, are very out with their neurodivergence, and certainly we can talk about some of them. I did an interview with the Neurodivergent Woman podcast recently, and it was a really, really beautiful chat with a psychologist named Monique Mitchelson, who is neurodivergent. And certainly Monique's taken that strength and taken her understanding and her lived experience of being autistic and being a psychologist, and use that to, I guess, try and create some resources that empower neurodivergent women to live their best lives and be their authentic selves. And Monique actually has a book that's just come out too, so it's certainly worth picking up. There are a number of researchers and bloggers across the spectrum, and if you just do a Google search for neurodivergent blog, you'll find a whole heap of them. Often people write under pseudonyms because they don't necessarily want to be identified. It's still a fine line in many professions, the walk between being your authentic self and having someone point at you and say you can't do that job anymore because you have this diagnosis. And that's a really hard thing to have to deal with. There's professional practice standards in most professions governing rules, governing laws that mean that if you have a disability or a mental health condition that impacts your practice, that you have to have special conditions put on your ability to practice. And that's a really difficult thing to deal with when, with the appropriate accommodations, those things shouldn't make a difference. at all. And there's a veterinary diversity, equity and inclusion group called the Veterinary Kaleidoscope who I do work with. And one of the things we're trying to change is the way fitness to practice legislation is enacted in the veterinary world, because there are neurodivergent people are often drawn to work with animals. I think the veterinary profession has quite a high proportion of neurodivergent individuals. Emergency practice, I think, has an even higher proportion of neurodivergent individuals. We thrive in sort of weird, dark places like emergency rooms. But there are some vets who are very public with their advocacy and their own identifications. And one of them is a vet named Kirsty Pickles, who's from the UK, who is an incredible advocate for autistic vets. And there's a vet from the USA called Ronald Souza, who also is a wonderful advocate for neurodivergent people. And these are people who aren't just doing this advocacy work, but they're also thriving as members of the profession that they represent. And I think we're back again to visibility, and we can't be what we can't see. So we need to see successful people so that we can be successful people regardless of what other characteristics we carry.
I really appreciate that. We can't be what we can't see. Leading by example with people in the profession, showing that it can be done, speaking about the challenges, sharing lessons learned is all extremely important and valuable to people.
Yeah.
Jody, you've written a guide for neurodivergent professionals, which is due to come out in July. And this is to help them navigate life professionally. Can you tell us a little bit more about it and how will it support them?
Yeah, so I guess what I tried to write was the book I wish I had when I was initially identified as being autistic. And it's a workbook to help you learn more about what we currently understand autism to look like, how that impacts on the way we see, feel, and interact with the world, and then trying to gain an understanding of what our own particular flavour of autism looks like, because it's a very mixed condition. So the workbook initially works through developing that understanding of what autism really is from a neuro-affirming perspective. So we're looking at autism as a normal difference in human development rather than a deficit. And there's good evidence to support the fact that it is just part of that spectrum of human development. So if we look at neurodivergence, literally, divergent means different. So if we look at neurodivergence as difference, not deficit, it allows us to see more of our strengths rather than just focusing on the things that are challenges. So the workbook goes through understanding what autism is, understanding your own autistic profile and how those things manifest for you, assessing how safe your workplace is as a place to disclose, and then developing a step-by-step action plan for how you're going to approach disclosure. Who's the right person to talk to? What are your rights in this space, in the jurisdiction that you live in? And how can you change the workplace with accommodations to make you lean into your strengths, but to buffer your challenges? So it really is very much a step-by-step how to do that. That literally, it's the closest I could get to walking through the journey with somebody holding their hand, because that's what I wish I'd had, somebody who could walk beside me and help me out. And so one of there's a lot of research around disclosure in the workplace for autistic people, which is wonderful. And I'm such a data nerd, so I really enjoyed the deep dive into the research to understand what we know from the lived experience of autistic people who've walked this pathway. And so taking those lessons and applying them to a journey that hasn't happened yet means that we can hopefully prevent some of the challenges that other people have faced from being a problem. We know that unless you have a strong autistic identity, so you have understood and accepted autism as part of yourself, and you understand what your autistic profile looks like, so how autism presents for you. Without those two things, disclosure is much less successful. If we don't know ourselves and if we aren't confident in who we are, we can't advocate for ourselves. So it seems like it's something that is fairly logical, but it's not always as simple as that. I remember reading my diagnostic report when I got my autism identification, and I looked at it and thought, well, I can't do anything now because this says I can't. And it was so deficit based.
Yeah.
Fortunately, I'm a data nerd. So the
And you
dive
flipped
into
it.
the research, Tom. Yeah, the diving, and I went as far as rewriting the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual definition of autism for myself from a neuroaffirming perspective to make sure that I could understand myself in a way that wasn't deficit based. And I think especially for newly adult diagnosed people, that deficit base is often what you're reeling from when you're thinking, should I disclose at work or not? So understanding yourself in a positive way and being able to advocate for yourself and knowing if your workplace is a safe place for you to disclose and advocate, they're all important things. And they're all things that the workbook will work through with you.
That's an amazing resource that is going to be so valuable. Congratulations on that, Jodie.
Everything that you've been saying there, I couldn't help but to think of the same book for younger people, because the same things are going on. And something you said it before just made me think of the benefits of positive psychology being introduced and how shifting the lens always from a deficit, the things they can't do or the behaviours that are distracting, but measuring on a neurotypical is a really unkind thing to do anyway. We should be talking about our humans and how that common humanity, we are all humans, but none of us are the same. And so why should we treat
and look, it's one of the
like
reasons I don't love the term neurotypical.
Yeah,
I tend to say neuromajority rather than neurotypical.
I like that.
And that's because it's a range, even for people who fit in that neuromajority. It's a range. It's always a range. While people who fit in that neuromajority, their brains may be more alike than the people who fit in the neurodivergent categories, it's still a range. It's all a spectrum of strengths and challenges, of ability. And it's really important that we recognise and understand that, because it makes us much better human beings at recognising and accepting when we do encounter difference.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more. Look, I guess, Jodie, as we're coming towards the end of this conversation, we're really curious, besides your amazing book, and I can't wait to read it either, do you have a resource, whether it's a book or a TED Talk or podcast, that you think might be of value to our listeners who would really like to dive into a little bit more?
If you are a neurodivergent person and you're looking to dive into a better understanding of your neurotype, then the Neurodivergent Woman podcast is my favourite neurodivergence podcast. There are, as I said, lots of blogs and Facebook pages and Instagram accounts that you can follow. TikTok has embraced the neurodivergence affirming paradigm, and you will find so many autistic people being their beautiful, authentic autistic selves on TikTok as well. So I never thought I'd be saying this, but head to social media, kids. It's a great place to actually hang out and meet your neurotribe. I guess the other thing that I think is probably really worthwhile doing if you're supporting somebody who is neurodivergent, it's really worthwhile just spending a little bit of time Googling around sort of neurodivergence affirming language and deciding what approach you're going to take to supporting them. It's having people who understand and appreciate those differences as part of your unique self, who will point out your strengths to you when sometimes you can't see them yourself, and will help you find answers when there are no answers existing in the world and you have to make up your own. It's a beautiful thing to have, and I want all the neurodivergent people out there to be supported by neurodivergence affirming practices, and that starts in people's homes. And I'm the parent of 3 neurodivergent adult children, and certainly discovering our neurodivergent, I actually was the first one to be identified, and then I went, oh crap, the kids are all neurodivergent too. So understanding that, we've actually been able to rewrite a lot of our history, and we have stronger and more connected relationships because we have more understanding. And I think that's a really wonderful thing that people can do, is rewriting history under the guise of understanding more makes such a difference to how you might feel about someone and the way they've behaved in the past. And it can be really healing. So it's certainly something worthwhile to look at.
I love that lens of considering it as a healing experience, definitely.
Yeah.
Jodie, at the beginning of our time together, you mentioned when we started the journey of positive psychology and those, all those interventions that we learned and perhaps challenged you in some way. What is something that you have rewritten perhaps as a wellbeing practice for you? Because we love to share for our listeners a wellbeing tip or strategy, and it would be so wonderful to hear from you one of your favorite strategies.
So for me, there are probably 3 things that work really well, work the way they're supposed to, despite my neurodivergent brain, and that I call on every day. Self-compassion and learning practices around self-compassion has been really healing for me. Through the lens of neurodivergence, I see behaviours that I always thought were failures or oddities as being perfectly acceptable and normal autistic or ADHD behaviours. So that learning to look through the lens of self-compassion and using self-compassion in mindfulness as well is really useful for me. Gratitude. I think gratitude may be one of the universal positive psychology interventions, because we can all find things in our lives to be grateful for. Even if those things initially at the time, and often especially if those things initially at the time challenged us, because being able to look for growth and be grateful for growth through challenge is an important part of coming to terms with our life's journey. And in terms of that growth, having a growth mindset is probably the third one. I can't do that yet, rather than I can't do that. And the idea that if something is hard, we can just practice until it's easy.
Jody, if people really want to connect with you and learn more about the wonderful work you're doing and find your book as well, where can they find you?
So they can have a look at my research profile at La Trobe Uni. If you just search Jody Wilson on the research profile, you'll find me. Or you can find me hanging out on Facebook or on, we have to call it X now, don't we? On X, I'm Dr. Jody the Vet. On Facebook, I'm Disrupt Vet. And all the book news is on my website at www.disrupt.vet.
And we'll be sure to share links to all the resources that you've mentioned today, as we know they'll be so valuable to our listeners. And thank you so much for helping us understand a little bit more about how we can show up differently and support and be there for others. So thank you so much.
Always happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Wow, I feel like I understand more now. I really like the perspective that you can't be what you can't see. And role modeling behaviors, understanding language, all of that I think was one of my biggest standouts. What about you?
I think, well, there were so many standouts, but I think weaving all the way through that conversation about the importance of that neurodiversity affirming practices.
Mm.
Rather than thinking that it's a problem and that they can't do things, when we shift that to a much more of a strength-based approach, and it's affirming who they are and the qualities and the strengths that they have, then that only affirms them further in knowing, what to do. And if there's something that is challenging for them, having that affirming person that's going to champion you and help you to actually pick up on something that might be an area of challenge and how to support you. Like having those things there to me was really what is a human experience. Yeah. And that's celebrating your common humanity. I think that was a big one for me.
Her book is going to be so helpful for so many, I think.
Absolutely. And I think when she mentioned about we need to make all these things visible, and having visibility is actually only going to, pardon me, benefit others to see the good in others.
Yeah. And the double empathy.
Yeah.
Having a foot in each world struck a chord with me as well. There's so much to absorb, isn't there, Lisa?
Oh, absolutely. But also, what about going right to the top of the conversation when she was a world-class vet, really, and then had a bit of a challenge, which really shook her identity and had to change the whole thing, which I suppose enabled her to do the most wonderful work she is doing, to be able to recalibrate what is her identity. That takes a lot of courage and strength to do that. Just a beautiful woman and a wonderful conversation. Well, take care, everyone, and have a great week, everyone.
Take care. Okay, bye for now.
Bye for now. Bye.
And thank you for listening to the Imperfect Us podcast. As always, we are extremely grateful to our executive producer, Brenton Ainsworth, for helping us to put this episode together. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with someone you care about, and we would be grateful if you could rate this podcast on iTunes. To continue the conversation and see what we're up to, you can connect with us on LinkedIn. Just search for Imperfect Us. Bye for now.